What is up, my fellow Shield Brothers? It is Shield Brother, here for the History Armada. And we are here on June 25th, as it is 2020, but we are to talk about an event of 1876, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Now, this is a historical event that is often familiar with a lot of Americans. It is often referred to as Custer's Last Stand. June 25th, 1876, General George A. Custer, leading roughly 250 men, attacked an encampment of Sioux Indians near Little Bighorn River in Montana. Custer and his men were then attacked by roughly 2,000 to 4,000 Lakota and Dakota Sioux, as well as Arapaho and Northern Cheyenne natives. Only one scout and a single horse survived, quote-unquote, Custer's last stand. On the Little Bighorn battlefield, news of the humiliating defeat infuriated most Americans and led to all-out war with these native groups. Within a year, the Sioux Indians were a broken and defeated nation. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was fought on June 25th, 1876, near the Little Bighorn River, where it gets its name in Montana Territory. It was not yet a state, it was a territory at this time. It pitted the federal troops led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer against a band of Lakota, Dakota, Sioux, and Cheyenne warriors and Arapaho warriors. Tensions between the two groups had been rising since the discovery of gold on Native American lands, when a number of tribes missed a federal deadline to move to reservations. The U.S. Army, including Custer and his 7th Cavalry, was dispatched to confront them. Custer was unaware of the large number of natives fighting under the command of Sitting Bull at Little Bighorn, and his forces were outnumbered and had outpaced their heavy guns and artillery, and they were quickly overwhelmed in what became known as Custer's Last Stand. They had underestimated the formation and the intelligence of the native groups yet again, and Custer and his 7th Cavalry had moved too quickly for his heavy guns and artillery to be any use against a massive force of natives. So this was all part of the 1876 U.S. military campaign. Colonel John Gibbons, column of 6 companies, A, B, E, H, I, and K, of the 7th Infantry, and 4th Companies, F, G, H, and L, of the 2nd Cavalry, marched east from Fort Ellis in western Montana on March 30th to patrol the Yellowstone River. Brigadier General George Crook's column of 10 companies, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, I, and L, and M, of the 3rd Cavalry, and 5 companies of cavalry of the 2nd Cavalry, A, B, D, and I, and 2 companies of the 4th Infantry, including D and F, and 3 companies, C, G, H, of the 9th Infantry, all moved from Fort Fetterman in the Wyoming Territory on May 29th, marching towards the Powder River area. Brigadier General Alfred Terry's column included 12 companies of cavalry under the 7th Cavalry, including Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's immediate command. This included A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, K, L, and M, a large detachment of 7th Cavalry. So, George Custer Armstrong's was the immediate command of Companies C and G of the 17th U.S. Infantry, and the Gatling Gun Detachment of the 20th Infantry departed westward from Fort Abraham Lincoln in the Dakota Territory on May 17th. They were accompanied by teamsters and packers with 150 wagons and a large contingent of pack mules that reinforced Custer. Companies C, D, and I of the 6th U.S. Infantry moved along the Yellowstone River from Fort Buford on the Missouri River to set up a supply depot and join Terry on May 29th. So you can see how spread out, and you can see the 3 prongs here of the movements into the Sioux territories. So as they did this, they were later joined there by steamboat Far West, which was loaded with 200 tons of supplies from Fort Lincoln. So we have the 3 prongs moving out, and we have a mix of heavily focused cavalry along with infantry supporting. We also had Gatling guns and a few cannonade. So the mounting tensions. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were the leaders of the Sioux on the Great Plains. strongly resisting the mid-19th century efforts of the U.S. federal government to confine their people to Indian reservations. In 1875, after gold was discovered in South Dakota's Black Hills, they decided that they were no longer going to take the federal efforts lightly, per se. After that, they decided that their people would not be confined to these Indian reservations. In 1875, after gold was discovered in South Dakota's Black Hills, the U.S. Army ignored previous treaty agreements and invaded the Sioux regions. This betrayal led many Sioux and Cheyenne tribesmen to leave their reservations and join Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse in Montana in an armed conflict. See, those that had peacefully moved to the reservation, as soon as their native land was invaded by the Federals in 1875, they left the reservation to go help fight the government. So the federal government kind of shot themselves in the foot here when they invaded and broke all former treaties. This betrayal outraged the Sioux and Cheyenne. By the late spring of 1876, more than 10,000 Native Americans had gathered in a camp along the Little Bighorn River, which they called the Greasy Grass, in defiance of a U.S. War Department order to return to the reservations of risk getting attacked. In mid-June, 3 columns of U.S. soldiers lined up against the camp and prepared to march. A force of 1,200 Native Americans turned back the first column on June 17th. 5 days later, General Alfred Terry ordered George Custer's 7th Cavalry to scout ahead for enemy troops. On the morning of June 25th, Custer, a West Point graduate and a man who had served in the had just barely missed getting his glory in the Civil War, drew near the camp and decided to press on ahead rather than wait for his infantry reinforcements and his Gatling gun reinforcements. Rather than wait for these important reinforcements, he pushed ahead with his 7th Cavalry. So the last stand. In the end, they are stuck on a hilltop, to which Custer had moved, and the hilltop that they had moved to, after being ridden down upon by Sitting Bull, was probably too small to actually accommodate all of the survivors and wounded and horses. Fire from the southeast made it impossible for Custer's men to secure a defensive position on this hill. All around this last stand hill, where the soldiers put up their most dogged defense, they did not actually have enough room to put up a proper defense of maneuver. According to Lakota scouts and accounts, far more of their casualties occurred in the attack on Last Stand Hill than anywhere else. The extent of the soldiers' resistance indicated they had few doubts about their prospects for survival. According to Cheyenne and Sioux testimony, the command structure rapidly broke down, although smaller last stands, quote-unquote, were apparently made by several groups, including Custer and his first men, noted here. So, Custer's remaining companies after the initial attack of the Sioux and Cheyenne was reduced down to E, F, and half a C, but they were soon killed as well as their companions had been. By almost all accounts, the Lakota annihilated Custer's forces within an hour of their first engagement. David Humphreys Miller, who between 1935 and 1955 interviewed the last Lakota survivors of the battle, wrote that the Custer fight lasted less than 1/2 an hour. Other native accounts said that the fighting lasted only, quote, as long as it takes a hungry man to eat a meal, end quote. The Lakota asserted that Crazy Horse personally led one of the large groups of warriors who overwhelmed the cavalrymen in a surprise charge from the northeast, causing a breakdown in the command structure and a panic among the troops. The cavalry of the 7th Company were greatly outnumbered because they had engaged with roughly 200-250 men against, as I stated, several thousands of mounted native warriors. The infantry and Gatling guns would have possibly been able to put up a better defense on these hilltops if General Custer had not decided to push ahead without his reinforcements. But the Lakota asserted that Crazy Horse personally led one of the large groups of warriors who overwhelmed the cavalrymen. As I stated, many of these men threw down their weapons while Cheyenne and Sioux warriors rode them down, counting coup with lances, coup sticks, and quartz. Some native accounts recalled this segment of the fight as a buffalo run, because they had thrown down their weapons and these federal soldiers were just treated as if buffalo on the plains. Captain Frederick Benton, battalion leader of companies D, H, and K, recalled his observations on the Custer battlefield on June 27, 1876, 2 days after the initial battle. I quoted, "I went over the battlefield carefully with a view to determine how the battle was fought. I arrived at the conclusion I hold now that it was a rout, a panic, until the very last man was killed. There was no line formed on the battlefield. You can take a handful of corn and scatter the kernels over the floor and make just such lines. There were none. The only approach to a line was where 5 or 6 dead horses found at equal distances like skirmishers. That was the only approach to a line of battle on this battlefield. There was more than 20 troopers killed in one group. There were more often 5 or 6 or 4 at one place, all within a space of 20 or 30 yards. There was no formal line. The horses and the soldiers were dead in clumps where they tried to make stands, lines, pairs. They were just spread out." A Brule Sioux warrior stated, quote, "In fact, Hollow Horn Bear believed that the troops were in good order at the start of the fight, and kept their organization even while moving from point to point," unquote. Red Horse and Oglala Sioux warrior commented, quote, "Here at Last Stand Hill, the soldiers made a desperate fight," end quote. One Hunkapa Sioux warrior, Moving Robe, noted that, quote, "It was a hotly contested, desperate battle," end quote. While another, Iron Hawk, stated, quote, "The Indians pressed and crowded right in around Custer Hill," what they named the Last Stand Hill. "But the soldiers weren't ready to die. We stood there a long time picking away at them," end quote. In a letter from February 21st, 1910, Private William Taylor, Company M, 7th Cavalry, wrote, "Reno proved incompetent and Benton showed his indifference. I will not use the uglier words that have often been on my mind about these commanding officers. Both failed Custer and he had to fight it out alone," end quote. So that brings us to Custer's final resistance. The 7th Cavalry's trumpet, here on the right, was found in 1878 on the grounds of the Little Bighorn battlefield, and it is on display in Camp Verde in Arizona. So recent archaeological work at the battlefield indicates that officers on Custer Hill restored some tactical order, although no lines of battle were initiated. E Company rushed off Custer Hill towards the Little Bighorn River, but failed to reach it, which resulted in the total destruction of E Company. This left about 50 to 60 men, mostly from F Company and the staff, including General Custer, on Last Stand Hill. The remainder of the battle took on the nature of a running fight. Modern archaeology and historical Indian accounts indicate that Custer's forces may have been divided into roughly 3 groups, with the Indians attempting to prevent them from effectively reuniting or retreating. Indian accounts describe warriors, including women, running up from the village to wave blankets in order to scare off the soldiers' horses. One 7th Cavalry troop claimed finding a number of stone mallets consisting of round cobble weighing 8 to 10 pounds with a rawhide handle, which he believed had been used by the Indian women to finish off the wounded. Fighting dismounted, the soldiers' skirmish lines were overwhelmed. As I stated earlier, there was no line of battle. They were just completely overwhelmed, individualized, scattered, and putting up a desperate last battle. Army doctrine would have called for 1 man in 4 to be a horse holder behind the skirmish line of the other 3 who were dismounted taking shots, and in an extreme case, 1 man in 8. Later, the troops would have bunched together in defensive positions and are alleged to have shot their remaining horses as cover. As individual troopers were wounded or killed, initial defensive positions would have been abandoned as untenable and pushed back to Last Stand Hill. Under threat of attack, the first U.S. soldiers on the battlefield 3 days later hurriedly buried the troopers in shallow grave, more or less where they had fallen and were found. A couple of years after the battle, markers were placed where men were believed to have fallen. So the placement of troops has been roughly constructed and construed. No one's exactly sure where people fell, and no one's exactly sure what these desperate lines of battle were. The troops evidently died in several groups, including on Custer's Hill, which was the last stand hill, around Captain Miles Cale, and also strung out towards different groups throughout the Little Bighorn River. So there was a last breakout attempt. According to Indian accounts, about 40 men on Custer Hill made a desperate stand around Custer, delivering volley fire, reminiscent of the battle between the British forces and the Zulu warriors, if you think of Rorke's Drift and other similar battles. The great majority of the Indian casualties were probably suffered during this close segment of the battle, as the soldiers and Indians on Calhoun Ridge were more widely separated and traded fire at greater distances for most of their portion of the battle than did the soldiers and Indians on Custer Hill. Modern documentaries suggest that there may not have been a quote-unquote last stand as traditionally portrayed in popular culture. Instead, archaeologists suggest that in the end, Custer's troops were not surrounded, but rather overwhelmed by a single charge. This scenario corresponds to several Indian accounts stating Crazy Horse's charge swarmed the resistance, with the surviving soldiers fleeing in a panic. Many of these troopers may have ended up in a deep ravine 300 to 400 yards away from what is known today as Custer Hill. At least 28 bodies, the most common number associated with burial witness testimony, including that of Scout Mitch Boyer, were discovered in or near the gulch, their deaths possibly the battle's final actions. Although the marker for Mitch Boyer was found accurate through archaeological and forensic testing of remains, it is some 65 yards away from the deep ravine. Historian Douglas Scott theorized that the deep gulch, or deep ravine, may have included not only the steep-sided portion of the coulee, but the entire drainage including its tributaries, in which case the bodies of Boyer and others were found where eyewitnesses stated had said they were seen. Other archaeological explorations done in Deep Ravine found no human remains associated with the battle. Over the years since the battle, skeletal remains that were reportedly recovered from the mouth of the Deep Ravine by various sources have been repatriated to the Little Bighorn National Monument and given over to them there. According to Scott, it is likely that in the 108 years between the battle and Scott's excavation efforts in the ravine, geological processes caused many of the remains to become unrecoverable. For example, near the town of Garryowen, portions of the skeleton of a trooper killed in the Rena Retreat were recovered from an eroding bank of the Little Bighorn River, while the rest of the remains had apparently been washed away by the river. So they had tried to make a breakout attempt to the river when that last charge of Crazy Horse, sorry. That last charge of Crazy Horse's men charged the remaining federal troops. They had tried to make a breakout attempt to the Little Bighorn River, but it is evident that they either were struck down before they could reach the river, or they were pushed into the deep ravine where they plummeted probably to their death. So the Battle of the Little Bighorn, also called Custer's Last Stand, marked the most decisive Native American victory and the worst U.S. Army defeat in the Long Plains Indian War. The demise of Custer and his men outraged many white Americans and confirmed their image of these savage Indians as wild and bloodthirsty. Which is, of course, not true, but that was the perceived image, especially with events like this happening. Meanwhile, the U.S. federal government increased its efforts to subdue the tribes. Within 5 years of the Battle of Little Bighorn, almost all of the Sioux and Cheyenne natives would be confined to reservations. It was a valiant last stand for the federal officers, and it was a valiant last battle for the Sioux and Cheyenne to reclaim their lost land from the U.S. federal government. I hope you have enjoyed today's video. I hope you have learned a little something about the 1876 campaign, the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Stand, and I hope, of course, you enjoyed. If you did enjoy, please consider giving me a like and a subscribe. If not, leave a dislike and leave me a comment. If you have comments, concerns, or suggestions, you can leave that in the comment section down below for me. Other than that, I am the ShieldBro for the History Armada. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll catch y'all next time.